Well, good evening and welcome to our Friday night Bible study. This will be for Friday, February 14, 2025. It's Valentine's Day. And nothing particularly unusual took place this week. It did rain. My wife hollered at me at some point during the week and said, "What's that roaring sound?" Well, it turns out that it was raining. We have an old gutter on one side of the house, and it goes across the edge of the carport. Now, the carport is short. It's not quite long enough for the car that I parked there, unless I push the bumper up against the wall of the house. And I don't usually do that. I need room to walk around behind it. So I leave that room, and the front of the car, since I back in, sticks out in front of the edge of the roof. And as I say, that gutter is old, and right in the middle, over the hood of the car, it sags down and it leaks. So whenever it rains, water pours out at that point and lands on the hood of the car. And you've got then the whole area of the hood to amplify the sound. So that was the roaring sound she was hearing, was the water pouring out of that gap in the gutter and landing on the hood of the car. So it did rain. It was pretty cold on Monday when I went shopping. I'm not remembering. I did go out shopping again Wednesday because I forgot some things. Plus, I stopped by at the pharmacy on Monday because I had a prescription that I needed to pick up. And I asked them when I was there, "Does my wife have anything?" "No, nothing." I got home, and within an hour or two, she was telling me, "Oh, they just texted me. They're going to refill such and such prescription." Well, it took them a while to get it refilled because they had to ask for a refill from the doctor. They had to ask, the doctor had to approve it. So they let her know Wednesday morning, shortly before I went out on my second shopping trip, that it was there. So I picked it up. And, well, that was our week.
We had a little fun earlier today, traveling down memory lane.
She has been paying attention to events taking place in the Commonwealth or state of Massachusetts. That's where Boston is, by the way. There was a death of a police officer in a suburb of Boston, south of the main part of the city. He was found injured and near dead in somebody's yard at about 6 o'clock in the morning, and indications were he'd been there for several hours. His girlfriend at the time was accused of murdering him by running into him with her Lexus SUV at 24 miles an hour in reverse. And a lot of people say his injuries aren't congruent with having been hit by a vehicle. There's evidence he was in the house when the people in the house say, no, he never went into the house. There's just a lot of crazy stuff going on. It's become quite a sensation on the internet with people putting up opinion pieces about what's going on. And
Look, the phone data showed that he was going up and down the hill on such and such a street while, I'm sorry, the police, the prosecution said that the phone data showed he was going up and down due to the hills on a certain street, but the defense said that the phone data showed that the up and down motion was on the stairwell inside the house where he was found on the lawn. Somebody went and took a video and posted it online of the hill, plural, where the prosecution is claiming it took place, and it's just as flat as can be. No ills at all.
Well,
lie after lie after lie.
I don't want to really get into all of that. She was listening to that, and somebody who was commenting on it talked about that part of Massachusetts being an Orwellian dystopia. And she was telling me about it. I told her, well, do you know where that comes from? Why they say Orwellian? Well, it comes from George Orwell, who released a novel in 1949 titled 1984. Now, that was over 30 years in the future at the time the book was released. And it was a novel about doublespeak and how lies become truth and how Big Brother is supposed to be taking care of you when in fact he's just stealing all your liberties. And it was a novel about a dystopian future. So the term has become, has been coined Orwellian dystopia. As I was telling her about it, she was remembering a song that she had heard. She actually had a 45 RPM single of the song about 1984, and she was quoting me some of the words. And I asked her who did it, because I'd never heard of it. And she thought, well, maybe it was Chicago. Well, I wasn't sure, so I thought, well, I'll go look it up. So I looked it up, and the search engine came up with a song by David Bowie, released on an album in 1974, and it was released as a single in the United States. It was titled 1984. It was actually part of a musical that David Bowie wanted to produce based on the novel 1984. The musical never got produced because George Orwell's widow would not grant permission for that to happen. But the music did get released. However, when my wife heard the first little bit of it, she says, no, that's not it. So then we took a while to do searching. The search engine see hit song titled 1984 from the 70s and wants to give you a list of the top hits of 1984. And so it took a while to convince the search engine to actually look for songs named 1984. And eventually it did come up with a few additional songs besides David Bowie, one of them by a group from the late 60s known as Spirit. And so she found a video with that song and she listened to it. Yes, that's the one I remember. Is that it?
Yeah.
So, it's amazing what today's technology enables and the kind of information that you can collect just sitting in your chair at your computer these days. That kind of connectivity and that availability of information, just unheard of when my wife and I were children. You know, if you wanted to find something, they tell you, oh, go look it up in the encyclopedia.
Go to the library.
Yeah, or go to the library. All of which didn't have anything all that current. So, just the march of time and the changes that have come to our society and what technology has done, both for good and for ill. So I think what we need to do is just go ahead and get started, and we'll talk about where we are and what we're reading as soon as we do so. So let's bow our heads. Our Father in heaven, we thank you for your blessings. We thank you for the week that is past and for both the joys and the sorrows of the week. We thank you for the opportunities that this has presented us to grow in your grace. And as we take a little time apart now to examine the written word, we want this exercise to aid in our growth in grace and in reflecting your character. So as we open the word, we want the Holy Spirit to be part of what we do, that each person might receive the specific blessing they need at this moment. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. So, we have been reading in the book of 1 Samuel, and we have run across a name that has perhaps more coverage in the Bible than anybody except for Jesus and possibly Moses. And that is King David, Israel's second king, someone who reigned for about 40 years. His predecessor, according to most scholars, reigned for 42 years, but that's based on a round number in the book of Acts that says that Saul reigned for 40 years, and the number that's given in the Hebrew that says he reigned for 2 years. Well, the details of the story change a little bit if Saul only reigned for 2 years, because then maybe Jonathan wasn't all that much older than David. Now, in, I think it's chapter 23, we ran across a brief note of Jonathan appearing and talking with David. And let me see if I can find that quickly here in the NIV so I can read it. Because as far as we can tell, that is the last meeting between David and Jonathan. And the accounts that are given don't give us a whole lot of time for the two to have become such close friends, which in my mind then gives credence to the idea that Saul did in fact reign for 40 years, which means David wasn't born until some 10 years into Saul's reign. And so there was quite an age gap between David and Jonathan, but then they had the time to form a close friendship, which is mentioned, which, doing things together that are not mentioned in the narrative here in 1 Samuel. Yes, 1 Samuel 23, verse 15. While David was at Horesh in the desert of Ziph, he learned that Saul had come out to take his life. And Saul's son, Jonathan, went to David at Horesh and helped him find strength in God. "Don't be afraid," he said. "My father Saul will not lay a hand on you. You will be king over Israel, and I will be second to you. Even my father Saul knows this, which is why he was so intent on killing David to maintain his dynasty. The two of them made a covenant before the Lord. Then Jonathan went home, but David remained at Horish. And that's the last record we have of David and Jonathan meeting. Now, the meeting at the rock from a little bit earlier, where Jonathan shot the arrows and then sent his arrow boy home, is a poignant moment. But this is also a poignant moment because it is probably the last time the two actually saw each other in person. Now, the story that we ended with last week was the story of Nabal and Abigail. A negative, toxic man married to an intelligent and lovely in character wife, which makes you wonder what her life must have been like living with a man like Nabal, and suggesting that it had not been her choice, that the marriage was something arranged. Now, we know that Nabal is descended from the line of Caleb. So he was from a prominent family, he was wealthy, and so in those days of arranged marriages, families would try to arrange a marriage for their daughter that gave her an advantaged position. So in her family's mind, Nabal was a great candidate to marry their daughter. But if she's as wise as the narrative makes her out to be, maybe she, even at that age, was aware that Nabal was not going to be a nice man to live with. And yet, because of the culture and the situation, she had to marry him and live with him anyway. In which case, this incident with David was a deliverance for her. And chapter 25 of 1 Samuel, at its end, informs us that David took her in as one of his wives, and she moved happily into that arrangement. And it also notes at a close, and that's what we closed with last week, that meanwhile Saul had taken his daughter Michal, who had been married to David and who had protected David when he fled from Saul, and gave her to somebody else. And of course, that's going to come up in the next book. We probably won't get there now, but tonight. But in the next book, there will be an incident, a couple of incidents involving Michal, daughter of Saul. So let's switch our view here, and we keep reading now in the book of 1 Samuel. Now, the division of these books, we pointed out before that these two books and the next two books, 1st and 2nd Kings, are all part of one narrative. And in fact, at least in German and probably in some other languages, the books are not separated, but are in fact 1 through 4 kings, König in the German, which means kings. So they're just the 4 books of the kings in some languages. And they're clearly all part of a single narrative, probably put together by multiple authors. And we believe that the prophets had a hand in it. And one of the reasons for believing that is that there is a story repeated 3 times in the Old Testament. And that's the story of the siege of Jerusalem by Assyria and by the Assyrian field commander. That story is repeated in the books of Kings. I believe it's in 2 Kings somewhere. It's also in the books of Chronicles, although it's told a little bit differently there. And it's told in the book of Isaiah. And the account in Isaiah is very nearly word for word the account that appears in the books of Kings, which leads me to believe that the prophets had a hand in preparing these books. So it is likely that we call this in the next book Samuel, although Samuel's already dead and we're not to the end of 1 Samuel. But it is likely that Samuel did have a hand in preparing at least part of this narrative. And it was from there on various prophets who kept track of the events in the nation of Israel and later in the divided nations of Judah and Israel, and kept that record. And so that these books tell the story from the viewpoint of the prophets. The story is retold in less detail in the books of Chronicles, which have a big focus on genealogy, and we've talked in the past about why the people who prepared Chronicles had such a focus on genealogy. And there are some differences in the stories that lead us to an understanding of the differences in the Hebrews' grasp of universal reality and how it changes over time, because the books of Chronicles were prepared post-exile, whereas the books of Kings were prepared more or less as the events happened. And it is the books of Chronicles that tend to more often take make moralistic judgments on the events. The books prepared by the prophets, Samuel and Kings, are less likely to make moralistic judgments, but simply just tell us this is what happened. And again, that gives us a view of the mindset of the people who prepared these writings. At any rate, here we are at 1 Samuel chapter 26, and we've just completed this story of Nabal and Abigail and their interface with David. And so now it tells us in the subtitle that David spares Saul again. Now you probably recall that last week we read the story of David at the cave of Adullam and how Saul went into the cave to relieve himself and apparently in the process took a nap in there, and David came upon him and his men encouraged him to kill Saul. Hey, this man's trying to kill you. Get rid of the threat. Kill him. Do to him as he intends to do to you. David.
That last week.
What?
You mentioned that last week.
Yeah, I'm recounting what we read last week.
I must have been asleep. I would have said something.
What would you have said?
I don't know, but it would have been snarky about falling asleep in the toilet.
Oh, well. At any rate, David did cut off part of the hem of Saul's garment. I think the King James uses the term, he cut off the corner of his garment, and left the cave. And when Saul came out, he confronted him. And so at that point, Saul quit chasing David. Now, that's significant to me, because the interpretation that says that Nabal died out of fear for his wife having aided David for fear of what the king might do to him, it kind of falls apart there, because at this point in history, David and Saul have called a truce. Now, it's not a long lasting truce, but at the time of the story of Nabal and Abigail, there is a truce between David and Saul. David's still hiding. He doesn't trust Saul. Trust has to be earned, and Saul hasn't earned it. But David has not attempted to take Saul's life when he had the opportunity. And now it's going to happen again. And so the narrative tells us, now some men from Ziph came to Saul at Gibeah. Remember, that was Saul's hometown, and it's essentially what he made his capital, to tell him, David is hiding on the hill of Hakilah, which overlooks Jeshimon. So Saul took 3,000 of Israel's elite troops and went to hunt him down in the wilderness of Ziph. Now remember, David has about 600 men with him at this point in time. Saul's taking 300 of Israel's elite troops. David's men were just men who were at odds with the government of Saul, or who were economically distressed. So he hasn't got exactly the best army with him. So we're seeing a definite, like 5 times over, disadvantage both in numbers and in quality of the troops being brought out here. He brings these 3,000 troops and went to hunt him, that is David, down in the wilderness of Ziph. Saul camped along the road beside the hill of Hakilah near Jeshimon, where David was hiding. When David learned that Saul had come after him into the wilderness, he sent out spies to verify the report of Saul's arrival. David slipped over to Saul's camp one night to look around. Saul and Abner, son of Ner. Now, I think this is the first place we run across him. He is Saul's essentially commander-in-chief. He's the top general in Saul's army. And he will have an important part to play from here on until his assassination. And his assassination will be a tale of shame. But it says here, Saul and Abner, son of Ner, the commander of his army, were sleeping inside a ring formed by the slumbering warriors. Who will volunteer to go in there with me? David asked Ahimelech the Hittite, and Abishai, son of Zeruiah, Joab's brother. Zeruiah, we will find out later, is one of David's sisters. So that makes Joab and Abishai nephews to David. Remember, David's the youngest son, so he's probably younger, possibly even quite a bit younger than Zeruiah, so that Joab and Abishai and their brother, I think Asahel, the 3 of them, are about David's age. And in fact, Joab will outlive David. And we, some time ago, did a sermon presentation, which we did a character study on Joab. At any rate, I'll go with you, Abishai replied. So David and Abishai went right into Saul's camp and found him asleep with his spear stuck in the ground beside his head. Abner and the soldiers were lying asleep around them. Now this sounds kind of dramatic. Here is a nighttime raid. They're going into the enemy camp, sneaking in at night while everybody's asleep. And they come across Saul and his chief of staff. They're lying there asleep, about as vulnerable as they can be.
probably drunk.
Might have been, who knows. God has surely handed your enemy over to you this time, Abishai whispered to David. Let me pin him to the ground with one thrust of the spear. I won't need to strike twice. Now, this gives us an insight into the mindset of these brothers. And that's going to be important as we go on through the story. The mindset of these brothers and their motivations and why they do things the way they do. And we're seeing it revealed already here. Hey, I know what I'm doing. I know how to kill a man in a single blow. Let me pin him to the ground with one thrust of the spear. I won't need to strike twice. No, David said. Don't kill him. For who can remain innocent after attacking the Lord's anointed one? Very similar language to the language David used when he came across Saul in the cave. Surely the Lord will strike Saul down someday, or he will die of old age or in battle. The Lord forbid that I should kill the one he has anointed. But take his spear and that jug of water beside his head, and then let's get out of here. So David took the spear and jug of water that were near Saul's head. Then he and Abishai got away without anyone seeing them or even waking up, because the Lord had put Saul's men into a deep sleep. I could offer an opinion here about whether or not the Lord did it. We know that the writers here have the opinion that if something happened, God did it. So if Saul and his men were in a deep sleep, God did it. And maybe he did. Maybe in this case, God protected David by making sure that these men all slept soundly while David and his friends were sneaking around inside their camp. But you notice here that it says here, even David suggests that surely the Lord will strike Saul down someday, because that was their mindset. And, if God is for you, then you need somebody killed. Maybe God will do it for you. That's how they thought. David climbed the hill opposite the camp until he was at a safe distance. Then he shouted down to the soldiers and to Abner, son of Ner. Wake up, Abner. Who is it? Abner demanded. Well, Abner, you're a great man, aren't you? David taunted. Where in all Israel is there anyone as mighty? So, why haven't you guarded your master the king when someone came to kill him? This isn't good at all. I swear by the Lord that you and your men deserve to die because you failed to protect your master, the Lord's anointed. Look around. Where are the king's spear and the jug of water that were beside his head? Now, this is a case, I think, of the backhanded compliment. He says of Abner, where in all Israel is there anyone as mighty? But then he calls him out for having not protected the king. And as evidence, he holds up the spear and the water jug. Saul recognized David's voice and called out, Is that you, my son David? And David replied, Yes, my lord the king. Why are you chasing me? What have I done? What is my crime? But now, let my lord the king listen to his servant. If the Lord or Yahweh has stirred you up against me, then let him accept my offering. But if this is simply a human scheme, then may those involved be cursed by the Lord. This is the language and thinking that David will use essentially all of his life, and that is included in all those vengeance psalms that we discussed a few weeks back. For they have driven me from my home, so I can no longer live among the Lord's people. And they have said, go worship pagan gods. Sounds to me like a bit of gaslighting. You don't belong with us. You shouldn't be worshiping our God. You're going to live outside the country, so go worship those other gods. Must I die on foreign soil, far from the presence of the Lord? Why has the king of Israel come out to search for a single flea? Why does he hunt me down like a partridge on the mountains? Then Saul confessed, I have sinned. Come back home, my son, and I will no longer try to harm you, for you valued my life today. I have been a fool and very, very wrong. Now, is this a genuine confession, or is this, oops, I've been caught, I better save face here? Here is your spear, O king, David replied. Let one of your young men come over and get it. The Lord gives his own reward for doing good and for being loyal, and I refuse to kill you, even when the Lord placed you in my power, for you are the Lord's anointed one. Now, may the Lord value my life, even as I have valued yours today. May he rescue me from all my troubles. And Saul said to David, blessings on you, my son David. You will do many heroic deeds, and you will surely succeed. Then David went away, and Saul returned home. Now, I would like to comment briefly on this issue of the Lord's anointed one. Samuel himself had anointed Saul to be king over Israel. And since Samuel was a prophet of Yahweh, then that made Saul the Lord's or Yahweh's anointed one. Did that make him good? Well, obviously not. The man was mentally ill, he was demented, and his mental illness stemmed from his self-focus and his insistence on maintaining his dynasty into the future. But he was still the Lord's anointed one. Might there be people in our day that we might call the Lord's anointed one? And that brings to mind a Lutheran clergyman from the 1940s, and I can't bring him to mind right now, but he opposed Adolf Hitler and is well regarded because of his opposition.
Bonhoeffer?
What?
Bonhoeffer?
You're not coming through loud enough for me to hear what you're saying.
Was his name something like Bonhoeffer?
No, I'm thinking his first name was Peter, but I'm not positive about that.
Well, I was thinking of the guy that actually put the bomb.
Took the bomb.
Placed the bomb
Oh.
in the briefcase.
Well, yeah, and that's the story that I was getting to, because this clergyman got involved in that plot, and it was for his involvement on that plot that Hitler had him executed. And there is a movement out there to hold him up as a sort of martyr because Hitler executed him, but he was executed for his involvement in a plot to assassinate Hitler.
And Hitler had him executed naked to add insult, to add a rub to the insult.
Well, nobody's saying Hitler was a good man. And nobody would, I don't think anybody would suggest that Hitler was the Lord's anointed one. He was a defective leader, just like Saul. David, the man of blood, refused to kill Saul when he had the opportunity. This man got involved in a plot to assassinate Adolf Hitler. And I think, in my mind anyway, that crossed the line. He was no longer a martyr. Granted, his execution may not have been warranted, but neither was his involvement in the attempt to assassinate Adolf Hitler. In the end, Adolf Hitler assassinated himself. In the end, his reign of terror came to an end. In the end, Saul's reign will come to an end. We'll probably get there this evening. So, the one way that I look at this is that if you're involved in a local congregation, the person charged with overseeing that congregation, the pastor of that church, was appointed to that position through anointing, at least in most denominations, some sort of ordination ceremony. And although that's something that humans do, there is a sense in which that makes that person the Lord's anointed one. Now, are pastors sometimes corrupt? Are they wrong? Do they sometimes get involved in silencing the truth about God because it doesn't fit into their preconceived notions about, life, the universe, and everything? Yes. But I would say that the meaning of what we're reading here, with David refusing to harm the Lord's anointed, would apply in that case, that even if we are oppressed by someone in a responsible position, it is not our place to denigrate them or to say bad things about them to others, that we should refuse to lay our hands figuratively on the Lord's anointed one. Tell the truth and quit calling out error, because everybody wants to call out error. It's more important to tell the truth. Next chapter. David, as we have said, didn't trust Saul. Saul hadn't earned trust, so David didn't give it. But David kept thinking to himself, someday Saul is going to get me. The best thing I can do is escape to the Philistines. Then Saul will stop hunting for me in Israelite territory, and I will finally be safe. So David took his 600 men and went over and joined Achish, son of Maoch, the king of Gath. Does that name sound familiar? It should. Both Gath and Achish should sound familiar. Because when David first fled from Saul, right after he visited the priests and got the sword of Goliath and the showbread, he went to Achish, king of Gath. And Achish's men were suspicious and didn't like the idea, and David got afraid, and at that point he was by himself. He pretended to be a madman and said silly things and let his spittle drool onto his beard. And Achish finally said, "Why did you bring me this madman? Don't I have enough of him already?" And David was able to get away. But now he's come back. David and his men and their families settled there with Achish at Gath. David brought his 2 wives along with him, Ahinoam from Jezreel, and Abigail, Nabal's widow, from Carmel. These 2 names will come up again when we get into 1 Samuel. Ahinoam was the mother of David's oldest son. Abigail apparently is the mother of David's second oldest son. But when we look at the stories and about the issues of succession to David, Abigail's son does not enter the picture. And when we get there, we'll talk about why that might be. Word soon reached Saul that David had fled to Gath. So he stopped hunting for him. One day David said to Achish, "If it's all right with you, we would rather live in one of the country towns instead of here in the royal city." So Achish gave him the town of Ziklag, which still belongs to the kings of Judah to this day being whenever this was written. And they lived there among the Philistines for 1 year and 4 months. Now, there's another bit of evidence that Saul's reign had to be longer than just 2 years. Because there's 1 year and a third that David lives among the Philistines. And we have all the history before that that would have had to take place in just 8 months. And that seems exceptionally unlikely. So, David and his men spent their time raiding the Geshurites, the Girzites, and the Amalekites, people who had lived near Shur toward the land of Egypt since ancient times. David did not leave one person alive in the villages he attacked. He took the sheep, goats, cattle, donkeys, camels, and clothing before returning home to see King Achish. "Where did you make your raid today?" Achish would ask. And David would reply, "Against the south of Judah, the Jerahmeelites and the Kenites." Well, that wasn't what he was doing. But he was telling Achish that because that's what Achish would want to hear. No one was left alive to come to Gath and tell where he had really been. This happened again and again while he was living among the Philistines. Achish believed David and thought to himself, "Now the people of Israel must hate him bitterly. Now he will have to stay here and serve me forever." Now, here the book is just telling us what happened. And as we've noted, it is not making a moral judgment about whether what David's doing here was right or wrong. David is supporting his men essentially by making raids on villages and killing everybody in the villages so nobody's left to tell where he's been and who he's been killing. And then he compounds the immorality by lying to Achish about it, essentially for his own benefit, so that he can continue to live there. I'll let you draw your own conclusions about the morality there. Saul consults a medium. About that time, the Philistines mustered their armies for another war with Israel. King Achish told David, "You and your men will be expected to join me in battle." "Very well," David agreed. "Now you will see for yourself what we can do." Then Achish told David, "I will make you my personal bodyguard for life." Well, Achish has been taken in by David's lies, but not everybody, as we will soon see. Meanwhile, Samuel had died, we read that earlier, and all Israel had mourned for him. He was buried in Ramah, his hometown, and Saul had banned from the land of Israel all mediums and those who consult the spirits of the dead. Now, this kind of makes it sound like Saul was doing a good thing. The books of Moses condemned the use of this type of omen seeking and the consulting the spirits of the dead and mediums and so forth, and ultimately had decreed the death penalty for such persons. Well, now Saul, possibly in an attempt to win back Samuel, because we know he did things several times, like attack the Gibeonites, trying to win Samuel's approval. And so this move to evict or kill all the mediums and spiritists in the land may have been part of that campaign. And this is being mentioned for good reason, because such people are now hard to find. Meanwhile, the Philistines set up their camp at Shunem, and Saul gathered all the army of Israel and camped at Gilboa. Gilboa's an important name, because this is where Saul's final battle will take place. When Saul saw the vast Philistine army, he became frantic with fear. He asked the Lord what he should do, but the Lord refused to answer him, either by dreams or by sacred lots or by the prophets. Now, sacred lots there has a footnote. Probably there's a difference by Urim and Thummim. Now, there are different opinions about what the Urim and Thummim actually were. Some believe that they were like dye that were kept in a little box on the priest's chest and were used for casting lots. Others suggest that they were worn on the priest's ephod, on his garment, and one or the other would light up to indicate God's will. I have not found anything in the Bible itself that supports the light up interpretation, but it has been made. So, going back up here,
Thought that it would light up to give the answer, and I've often wondered, how? That doesn't make sense.
well,
I ended up just writing it off as another one of those teachings that illogical.
it does sound rather mystical to have a stone light up, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And we make the point here that mysticism is not appropriate in understanding God. God is real, not mystical. He may be able to do things that we as humans can't explain with our limited understanding of reality, but that doesn't mean they're not real. The miracles of Jesus seemed mystical, perhaps, to some of the people of Judah at the time, because they didn't understand disease and the causes of disease. But the healings that Jesus performed were very real. The people actually got well and were healthy when he was done. So, while the means by which Jesus did his miracles might have seemed mystical, they were in fact oriented in reality, and the healing that Jesus provided was not mystical, it was very real, and the people experienced genuine relief from their ailments. So, Saul sees the Philistines and he's afraid. And he has good reason to be, as we know. And he seeks advice from God, but God doesn't respond. And not only did he not respond by sacred lots, he didn't respond by the prophets. There weren't any prophets left who would speak to Saul for God. And Saul then said to his advisors, "Find a woman who is a medium, so I can go and ask her what to do." His advisors replied, "There is a medium at Endor." Now recall that Saul had earlier banned all those mediums and spiritists from Israel. But one of them apparently slipped through the cracks, and his men know about it. And so when he asks for one, they're able to tell him where he can find one. And it is from this then that we get the term the witch of Endor, because the medium sometimes gets referred to as a witch, and therefore the witch of Endor. It's like the saying that I heard, you're trying to get something where you want it and not to an extreme either side. And we have a term for that. We call it a happy medium. And a guy I knew back in the 70s referred to a happy medium as a drunk witch. Anyway, so Saul's advisor tells him about this spiritist at Endor. So, it says, Saul disguised himself by wearing ordinary clothing instead of his royal robes. And then he went to the woman's home at night, accompanied by 2 of his men. "I have to talk to a man who has died," he said. "Will you call up his spirit for me?" "Are you trying to get me killed?" the woman demanded. "You know that Saul has outlawed all the mediums and all who consult the spirits of the dead. Why are you setting a trap for me?" So this woman is suspicious. And with good reason. I mean, if Saul had outlawed and possibly even killed all the mediums and spiritists, and here she is herself a spiritist who shouldn't be amongst the Israelites, and yet there she is. But she's worried that this person coming to her, seeking to consult the dead through her, is setting a trap for her so that Saul can find her. Yeah. But Saul took an oath in the name of the Lord and promised, "As surely as the Lord lives, nothing bad will happen to you for doing this." Finally, the woman said, "Well, whose spirit do you want me to call up?" "Call up Samuel," Saul replied. Now, the narrative leaves out what happens from the point Saul says he wants Samuel called up until something claiming to be Samuel appears. I mean, it tells us, call up Samuel, Saul replied, and then immediately when the woman saw Samuel, she screamed, "You've deceived me! You are Saul!" Now, most people, what?
Doesn't it say that this thing came up from the ground?
Well, I think we're going to get there. This version won't say it like that, but other versions I think do.
And Samuel is believed to have gone to heaven, and hell is believed to be underground. So why is Samuel being called up from hell?
Okay, let me read this from the NIV. But the woman said to him, "Surely you know what Saul has done. He's cut off the mediums and spiritists from the land. Why have you set a trap for my life to bring about my death?" Saul swore to her by the Lord, "As surely as the Lord lives, you will not be punished for this." Then the woman asked, "Whom shall I bring up for you?" "Bring up Samuel," he said. I'm going to keep this open because we want to see how it renders the rest of this as we go on. So she sees Samuel. Now, we don't happen to believe that the dead can do anything. We believe that what Solomon said in Ecclesiastes, although he is a bit depressed as he writes it, is still accurate, and that is that the dead know nothing. They have no part in our affairs today. So if an apparition appears that looks like Samuel, who is it? Is this not a deception? And would this not then be the work of the deceiver, also known as the destroyer? And yet, this woman who has a link to these cosmic forces sees this spirit, or whatever it is, rising up out of the earth, and she recognizes in that, so it's apparently being revealed to her as this apparition arises, that the man who is consulting her is in fact the king of Israel, Saul. "Don't be afraid," the king told her. "What do you see?" She says, "I see a God coming up out of the earth," she said. Now, gods is a possible alternative translation for that. So let's read that in the NIV to see how that's rendered. "When the woman saw Samuel, she cried out at the top of her voice and said to Saul, 'Why have you deceived me? You're Saul. You are Saul.' The king said to her, 'Don't be afraid. What do you see?' The woman said, 'I see a spirit coming up out of the ground.'" And the NIV offers as an alternative rendering there, spirits or sea gods. So she sees this apparition, which she describes as gods, coming up out of the earth. "What does he look like?" Saul asked. "He is an old man wrapped in a robe," she replied. Saul realized it was Samuel, and he fell to the ground before him. "Why have you disturbed me by calling me back?" Samuel asked Saul. Well, you know, if you're deceiving, you have to make your deceit believable. So act like as if you really are Samuel when you talk to Saul. Because I am in deep trouble, Saul replied. The Philistines are at war with me, and God has left me and won't reply by prophets or dreams. So I have called for you to tell me what to do. Now, here's perhaps the most odd and interesting part of this story. But Samuel replied, "Why ask me, since the Lord has left you and become your enemy? The Lord has done just as he said he would. He has torn the kingdom from you and given it to your rival, David. The Lord has done this to you today because you refused to carry out his fierce anger against the Amalekites." Well, that is the incident at which Samuel rejected Saul completely. And so it would make sense then for this apparition to blame this incident and then to say, well, God was angry with the Amalekites and wanted you to destroy them, and you didn't do it as thoroughly as he intended. But recall, this is a deceiver here. What's more, the Lord will hand you and the army of Israel over to the Philistines tomorrow, and you and your sons will be here with me. The Lord will bring down the entire army of Israel in defeat. Now, what we can tell about this prediction, since we have 20/20 hindsight, is that this prediction is accurate. This apparition talking to Saul is telling him exactly what will happen, truthfully. Now, we've said that this is a deceiver. He's a deceiver. He's pretending to be Samuel. And he's repeating lies about God in the process. But recall what the writers are saying here. The writers are writing this as if Samuel actually did come back and talk to Saul, which leads me to believe that whoever wrote this actually believed that this medium had the ability to call on the dead and consult with them. So when they write it as if this actually is Samuel. Saul fell full length on the ground, paralyzed with fright because of Samuel's words. He was also faint with hunger, for he had eaten nothing all day and all night. When the woman saw how distraught he was, she said, "Sir, I obeyed your command at the risk of my life. Now, do what I say, and let me give you a little something to eat, so you can regain your strength for the trip back." But Saul refused to eat anything. Then his advisors joined the woman in urging him to eat, so he finally yielded and got up from the ground and sat on the couch. The woman had been fattening a calf, so she hurried out and killed it. She took some flour, kneaded it into dough, and baked unleavened bread. She brought the meal to Saul and his advisors, and they ate it. Then they went out into the night. Now the scene changes. The entire Philistine army now mobilized at Aphek, and the Israelites camped at the spring in Jezreel. As the Philistine rulers were leading out their troops in groups of hundreds and thousands, David and his men marched at the rear with King Achish. But the Philistine commanders demanded, "What are these Hebrews doing here?" Now, the narrative doesn't tell us what David planned to do. We know he was marching with the Philistine army, and he was marching toward the Hebrew army, did he intend to attack his own people? Now, the story we've already read about him raiding towns south of Philistia and coming back and telling Achish that he had gone into the south of Judah and conducted raids. That was a lie. We know he wasn't doing that. So it makes us wonder if David really intended to go to war against Israel, or if perhaps he was just planning to go to war against Saul's army. Or was he perhaps intending to turn on the Philistines in the heat of battle and help the Israelites win? The narrative never tells us, because David never got the opportunity to do that. See, now the Philistine commanders are demanding, wait a minute, what's he doing here? Remember that King Achish's own men at one point pointed out about how the people of Israel had sung about David killing his tens of thousands, and how he had been successful against the Philistines when he was in the king's service. And Achish told them, this is David, the servant of King Saul of Israel. He's been with me for years, well, a year and 4 months, and I've never found a single fault in him from the day he arrived until today. But the Philistine commanders were angry. Send him back to the town you've given him, they demanded. He can't go into battle with us. What if he turns against us in battle and becomes our adversary? Is there any better way for him to reconcile himself with his master than by handing our heads over to him? Isn't this the same David about whom the women of Israel sing in their dances? Saul has killed his thousands, and David his 10,000s. Well, that comes up again. So Achish finally summoned David and said to him, I swear by the Lord that you've been a trustworthy ally. I think you should go with me into battle, for I've never found a single flaw in you from the day you arrived until today. But the other Philistine rulers won't hear of it. Please don't upset them, but go back quietly.
Interesting that he swears by the Lord.
Yeah. Well, he's talking to David, so.
Does he believe in the Lord or not?
Who knows? Maybe he does. What have I done to deserve this treatment? David demanded. What have you ever found in your servant that I can't go and fight the enemies of my lord the king? But Achish insisted, as far as I'm concerned, you're as perfect as an angel of God, but the Philistine commanders are afraid to have you with them in the battle. Now get up early in the morning and leave with your men as soon as it gets light. So David and his men headed back into the land of the Philistines, while the Philistine army went on to Jezreel. So they've separated, and we will never know what David had in mind to do. Maybe the writers didn't know. Maybe David didn't even tell his men what he was thinking. Maybe David hadn't yet made up his mind, so he didn't know what he would have done. At any rate, it never gets revealed to us what David planned when he went to war with the Philistines. And we don't know because he didn't. When they demanded that he be sent back, David turned around and went back. 3 days later, when David and his men arrived home at their town of Ziklag, they found that the Amalekites had made a raid into the Negev and Ziklag. They had crushed Ziklag and burned it to the ground. They had carried off the women and children and everyone else, but without killing anyone. Now, this is odd in some ways, but not in others. I mean, what would David expect? He's been raiding the Amalekites and others, and attacking so viciously that he makes sure nobody is alive when he's done attacking. Are not these people going to figure out what's going on and hold a grudge against David? And it seems that's almost certainly the reason that they came to Ziklag. Now, the other oddity about this is that who are these people? They're Amalekites. I thought Saul had wiped them out. Well, apparently not, because there's still some Amalekites around. But, although they have a very negative reputation, in this case, they attack Ziklag, they burn the city to the ground, they capture the women and children that were left behind when David went to war, but they didn't kill anybody. When David raided cities, he killed everybody so nobody could tell the Philistines where he had raided. But while they're attacking David in retaliation, they're not killing anybody. Makes it sound to me like there are some certain godly characteristics to these people that they would not kill. When David and his men saw the ruins and realized what had happened to their families, they wept until they could weep no more. David's two wives, Ahinoam from Jezreel and Abigail, the widow of Nabal from Carmel, were among those captured. David was now in great danger because all his men were very bitter about losing their sons and daughters, and they began to talk of stoning him. But David found strength in the Lord his God. Then he said to Abiathar the priest, remember he's the only one left alive after Doeg the Edomite killed the priest's family in retaliation for helping David. Then he said to Abiathar the priest, bring me the ephod. So Abiathar brought it. And then David asked the Lord, should I chase after this band of raiders? Will I catch them? And the Lord told him, yes, go after them. You will surely recover everything that was taken from you. So David and his 600 men set out, and they came to the brook Besor. But 200 of the men were too exhausted to cross the brook, so David continued the pursuit with 400 men. Along the way, they found an Egyptian man in a field and brought him to David. They gave him some bread to eat and water to drink. They also gave him part of a fig cake and 2 clusters of raisins, for he hadn't had anything to eat or drink for 3 days and nights. Before long, his strength returned. To whom do you belong, and where do you come from? David asked him. I am an Egyptian, the slave of an Amalekite, he replied. My master abandoned me 3 days ago because I was sick. We were on our way back from raiding the Kerethites in the Negev, the territory of Judah, in the land of Caleb, and we had just burned Ziklag. Will you lead me to this band of raiders? David asked. The young man replied, if you take an oath in God's name that you will not kill me or give me back to my master, then I will guide you to them. So he led David to them, and they found the Amalekites spread out across the fields, eating and drinking and dancing with joy because of the vast amount of plunder they had taken from the Philistines and the land of Judah, including, of course, David's city or town of Ziklag. David and his men rushed in among them and slaughtered them throughout that night and the entire next day until evening. None of the Amalekites escaped except 400 young men who fled on camels. David got back everything the Amalekites had taken, and he rescued his 2 wives. Nothing was missing, small or great, son or daughter, nor anything else that had been taken. David brought everything back, which was... What? Oh, well, okay. This was an important thing for him to do because his men were upset and talking of stoning him because of what had happened. Well, if he gets it all back for them, then that's going to make them loyal to him again. He also recovered all the flocks and herds, and his men drove them ahead of the other livestock. This plunder belongs to David, they said. So he's getting his own stuff plus whatever plunder that these Amalekites had taken from the Philistines and from Judah. Then David returned to the brook Besor and met with the 200 men who had been left behind because they were too exhausted to go with him. They went out to meet David and his men, and David greeted them joyfully. But some evil troublemakers among David's men said, "They didn't go with us, so they can't have any of the plunder we recovered. Give them their wives and children and tell them to be gone." But David said, "No, my brothers, don't be selfish with what the Lord has given us. He has kept us safe and helped us defeat the band of raiders that attacked us. Who will listen when you talk like this? We share and share alike. Those who go into battle and those who guard the equipment." From then on, David made this a decree and regulation for Israel, and it is still followed today, today being whenever this was written. When he arrived at Ziklag, David sent part of the plunder to the elders of Judah, who were his friends. "Here is a present for you, taken from the Lord's enemies," he said. The gifts were sent to the people in the following towns David had visited: Bethel, Ramoth Negev, Jattir, Aroer, Sifmoth, Eshtemoa, Rachal, the Greek version reads Carmel there, the towns of the Jerahmeelites, the towns of the Kenites, Hormah, Borashan, Athik, Hebron, and all the other places David and his men had visited. And we may have time to do just one more chapter, which I believe will complete 1 Samuel. Now, the Philistines had attacked Israel. Remember, David got sent away, and he ends up on this chase for the Amalekites who had raided his town of Ziklag. And the men of Israel fled before them. Many were slaughtered on the slopes of Mount Gilboa. The Philistines closed in on Saul and his 3 sons, and they killed 3 of his sons: Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua. The fighting grew very fierce around Saul, and the Philistine archers caught up with him and wounded him severely. Come on, it says swipe up to answer, but I swipe up and it looks at me like I'm stupid. Hello. Oh, it's sending the audio over the computer. Let's do that. Try it again, see if I can hear you.
I need you to pause.
I will be done here in just a few minutes. Can it wait?
I'll try.
Okay. You want to stay on, or do you want to hang up again? Okay, she hung up again. Saul groaned to his armor bearer, "Take your sword and kill me before these pagan Philistines come to run me through and taunt and torture me." But his armor bearer was afraid and would not do it. So Saul took his own sword and fell on it. When his armor bearer realized that Saul was dead, he fell on his own sword and died beside the king. So Saul, his 3 sons, his armor bearer, and his troops all died together that same day. When the Israelites on the other side of the Jezreel Valley and beyond the Jordan saw that the Israelite army had fled and that Saul and his sons were dead, they abandoned their towns and fled. So the Philistines moved in and occupied their towns. The next day, when the Philistines went out to strip the dead, they found the bodies of Saul and his 3 sons on Mount Gilboa. So they cut off Saul's head and stripped off his armor. Then they proclaimed the good news of Saul's death in their pagan temple and to the people throughout the land of Philistia. They placed his armor in the temple of the Ashtoreths, and they fastened his body to the wall of the city of Bethshan. But when the people of Jabesh Gilead heard what the Philistines had done to Saul, all their mighty warriors traveled through the night to Bethshan and took the bodies of Saul and his sons down from the wall. They brought them to Jabesh, where they burned the bodies. Then they took their bones and buried them beneath the tamarisk tree at Jabesh, and they fasted for 7 days. Now, this makes sense. Recall that Saul's initial move as king was to save the people of Jabesh Gilead. So these people feel they owe a debt of gratitude to Saul, and after he dies, they take his body and the bodies of his sons and take them to their own city, burn them, and bury the bones. And then they fast for 7 days. And that is, I believe, the end of 1 Samuel. Yes. 2 Samuel is the next chapter, 2 Samuel 1. So since we've reached what I think is a good stopping point, and since it's getting close to an hour and a half, I think we'll stop right here, and we will pick up this story with 2 Samuel next week on the 21st. Today's the 14th, so a week from today will be the 21st. And we invite you, of course, to join us then. And until then, we say goodbye and God bless.